Welcome to This Golfing Life. My name is Dan Davis, and in each episode, I talk to a different guest about golf, life, and everything in between. We have something slightly different for you this week, a throwback to a golden age when the pro game was dominated by the Big Five.
I first met Seve in 1976, and I was introduced to him by another golf writer called Gordon Richardson. And Gordon and I were in some restaurant in Southport before the Open began, and in came 5 or 6 Spanish golfers, and Gordon knew them all. Gordon saying hello, and he said, "This guy you've got to meet, you've got to keep your eye on him. This is Severiano." And it was Seve as a, how old was Seve then? 19? And I'm a straight heterosexual man. But the first thing you thought about him was, Christ, he's good looking. It was like meeting Muhammad Ali for the first time.
Seve, Langer, Faldo, Lyle, and for the purposes of this podcast, Greg Norman. In a long and distinguished golf writing career, today's guest got to know them all and is uniquely placed to discuss their personalities and the dynamics between them.
If I get really angry, my instinct is to cry at the same time, which is a bit discouraging. Tears in my eyes with anger. I wanted to hit him. Now he's that much taller than me, so I'd have to reach up, but thankfully I didn't. Tried to do that. Funny looked at me, I just turned on my heel and walked away, and I thought, from here on in, Nick, every chance I get, I'm going to stick a pin into your leg.
He's reported from 33 Masters tournaments, 28 US Opens, and 40 Open Championships. So welcome to This Golfing Life, Mr. Bill Elliott. Delighted to have such a doyen of sports writing on the podcast. Bill, how many Open Championships have you attended as a journalist?
Actually been there.
Yeah.
The first one I went to was 1969 at Royal Lytham. I think I was the 5th person in the Daily Express team.
Right.
And my basic job was to make sure everybody got a cup of coffee in the morning. I did bits and pieces, but then it worked out great because that's the one that Tony Jacklin won.
Yes. I mean, what a way to make your Open Championship debut at the end of a very long drought for British golf. You wrote about a lot of different sports, started on football, but had a portfolio that went across tennis and boxing and Olympic Games and all sorts of things that we'll come back to. When did you transition more permanently or more in a more focused fashion into golf?
Well, really, I started to seriously do golf, not exclusively, but seriously do golf in 1979-80. And you could do golf because golf began the first European Tour event, as it was then called the European Tour, and I still think of it as the European Tour. But the first European Tour event didn't happen until the week after the Masters. And I think it was usually the Portuguese Open they had. And then it finished basically with a world match play at Wentworth at the beginning, early October. So in terms of if you wanted to do football and golf, you could.
How many weeks of that season were you traveling on the European Tour? Because the idea of sending a dedicated journalist to cover the European Tour to people who know the European Tour or the DP World Tour now would seem absolutely staggering. But there was a big press pack, wasn't there, that was following the European Tour?
It was, yeah. It was made up of national newspaper journalists, of which I was one. Some freelancers who were doing it for PA, who were doing it for Extel, who were doing it for various other people. So there were about, I would say, 15 to 20, a group of 15 or 20. Basically, some of them, like my really good friend Mitchell Platts, he was doing it for Thompson All Evenings and various other people. He wasn't doing it for a specific newspaper. He went to basically every one. Got in his car and drove into Europe and found them.
I mean, it was a shorter season then, as you said. It was April up until the Suntory World Match Play, at Wentworth, and then the tour, in around 1990-91, started to branch out into Dubai and other sort of territories. But it really was a very European circuit then. How significant was that 1979-80 transition in the sense that Seve had just won the Open in 1979.
Yeah.
Was the interest in golf having a serious uptick because of Seve and because of perhaps a stirring within non-American golf, shall we say?
Yeah, there was a sense of momentum, and obviously it was led by Seve, and Seve first rose up in a few years earlier at Southport when he did that great chip at the 18th, and Lee Trevina, who was watching from the clubhouse, squealed at the top of his voice, "That's a genius. That is a genius." And he was right, in a sense. And but it wasn't just him. I mean, you look at it, you've got Seve, Faldo, Sandy Lyle, Bernhard Langer, and Ian Woosnam. And they all started to really make their mark around the same time. Seve was the leader, without naming himself as the leader. And if you look at those guys, they were all born within 12-month period of each other in different countries in Europe. And in terms of what was their relevance to golf, they had the same relevance to golf that the Beatles had to popular music. They really interested the public. There was something for everyone, like the Beatles. Whoever you wanted, all the women loved Seve, and everybody liked Sandy, and Bernhard was a very nice guy, and they all became friends. They became friends, and they became friends to several of us journalists as well. We got to really know each other, and how they led. I mean, Seve could be an obstinate, cantankerous at times. Aren't we all? But his personality, his determination, and everything else set down a template that the others absorbed. They didn't look and copy; they just absorbed it. And when he won his Masters, they started thinking, well, I can win the Masters because I can beat Seve now and then, And so it really, he provided the momentum that the others absolutely gobbled up. Over the course of the 1980s, they turned the European tour from a golf tour looking for a place, looking for a niche, looking for proper fame, into everything that Ken Schofield, who was leading it at the time, and George O'Grady, who was his deputy, could have possibly hoped for. And we as journalists were very important to that. More important than I realized really at the time, because in terms of having what's your corporate game plan, we were their corporate game plan without us initially, certainly me, initially realizing it. We did the hard public access work for them just by being journalists.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that sports editors on national newspapers had obviously detected that the landscape was changing, that Seve won 4 of his 5 majors by 1984, which was before, I'm trying to think when Bernhard Langer won his first Masters. Was that 83 or 84? I can't remember.
It was the mid-80s. I should know because I was asked to do his life story afterwards in a book. So. But it was certainly mid-80s. It was certainly mid-80s. But that's the first book I ever did too.
I've got that. I've got a copy of that at home.
It's not a bad book, is it?
It's very good. I wanted to come on to Bernhard Langer, but I just want to talk about Seve in the sense that he'd, like you say, he'd set that template. He'd blazed a trail. Because before that, golf really was completely US dominated. I was looking up before this conversation a few details of that 1979 US Open that you attended at Inverness Club in Toledo, Ohio. Yeah. And you look at the leaderboard, and it's just American flags all the way down. You might see a David Graham pop up, or a Gary Player who was sort of reaching the end of his sort of potency, if you like, as a major player. But there were I think it was notable they decided to give an invitation that year to the person who'd finished top of the European Tour Order of Merit. So
I think you're probably right. Yeah.
It was completely dominated by Americans before that. But then, like you say, you've got this group of 5 extraordinary talents that are born within months of each other, that come through, and then suddenly the sports editors on national newspapers are thinking, this is worth space in my section of the paper. was it really about these guys? The fact that there were these, initially it was Seve, but then it was Langer, and then it was a few more of them.
Lyle,
but were they really buying into the connection with these guys as much as anything?
I'll tell you what Seve did. Seve moved sport. I mean, there was a lot of sports page coverage of Seve, but Seve also moved it onto the news pages and occasionally the front page of every national newspaper. He moved the needle from that lot all over there and made it everywhere. And the others, to lesser extents, but nonetheless, Faldo then did the same,
You worked on The Express from 1969, which was selling around 4 million copies a day. I mean, ridiculous.
It was. You can date its decline from when I joined in 1969.
I didn't want to mention that, Bill. I too have a similar record of closing publications, but at least you had a long way to go from 4 million copies. And then you went on to The Star when The Express decided to eventually, having thought about setting up a rival to the Telegraph, they think, well, actually, we're going to create a tabloid.
We're going to create a tabloid.
There was always a tension, wasn't there, between those writers on tabloids who were dedicated to covering a sport and those guys who were filling column inches in the news pages, weren't there? And actually, that could make difficulties for reporters like you, couldn't it, Bill?
Yeah, it could. It could. It really could. It could be quite vicious as well. And by the way, having worked at every level of newspaper, in down market, middle market, and up market, the upmarket ones, if a tabloid, if say the Sun or the Mirror or the Star, came out with a really good story about Seve or whatever, that Seve didn't want to be there, and I'm just saying Seve doesn't have to be Seve, they would quickly lift it. They would quickly use it. So I always said, I mean, within reason, I didn't care what anybody did. That was their life. They could get on with it. If there were lots of women involved, well, good luck to you, pal, if that's what you're into, and carry on. But I would tell most of them, I've told, I don't care what you do in your life, as opposed to on a golf course or on a football field or on a tennis court. But if you do it in public and I see it, I will do something about it. It's up to you.
Right.
It's just as simple as that. But I was never looking for it. Ever.
That's a difficult balance to maintain, isn't it? When you, on the one hand, you're first and foremost, you're a journalist and you're there to report on the event that you've been sent to cover.
Yeah.
But you develop friendships with all of those players. Seve, Sandy Lyle, Bernard Langer, Nick Faldo, Greg Norman. How do you balance the two things when, how close can a friendship be when that person knows that if they do step out of line, you will come down on them?
Well, it's a good question. I knew what I was doing, and they either accepted what I was doing and the way I did it, or they didn't. But they did accept it. They did accept it. And if I one night, doesn't matter which one of them it was, if they'd had a few drinks too many that night and were falling around or whatever, I wouldn't do anything on that. I'd just laugh at them. But if they turned up if they were married with a couple of kids and they turned up with an attractive younger woman in a short skirt or whatever in a bar, I'd say, who's your friend? I mean, what are you doing? Why are you doing this in public? Never mind me. There's lots of other people there too who aren't journalists. Yeah. And they can talk too, but basically none of them did. I mean, Seve loved women and he wasn't married at that time or anything, so he was enjoying himself. And others were in their own way too. But good luck to them, It didn't bother me if they were just doing what young men do. It didn't bother me in the slightest. No. Yeah. And I was a young man too, so there you go.
Who of that group of players was the hardest nut to crack, or the hardest person to get to know, or to allow you in, perhaps?
Well, probably he was very nice, but he was very cautious. Probably Bernhard Langer, because he was very straight. He's a very religious guy, extremely religious guy. And he was perfectly nice. You'd ask him a question, he'd give you an answer. But getting to know him as a rounded human being was more difficult because he was, generally speaking, he was quiet. He wasn't a show off. He didn't walk in a room and take over the room, whereas Seve did.
Yeah.
Without trying to. He just walked in and he took over the room. Bernhard could walk in, sit down, and almost nobody would notice him.
Yeah.
So he was harder. But when I did his life, when I was asked to do his life story for him, and we spent a lot of time together, and I went to Fussenalgau, which is the village in Germany where he grew up and where his dad, you've read the books, you know the story. His dad eventually found his way to after the Second World War. And I met his mum was still working as a waitress in the village pub, if you like. His dad was wearing overalls, doing some work in the garden. They were absolutely lovely. And I got to know steadily it took us, I think it took, because I would interview him every time I saw him for another chapter or whatever. I asked him, I said, right, okay, well, that's great. We've done a few chapters. Now, what I'd like you to do now, Bernhard, is think of, amusing, funny, unusual things that have happened to you.
Good luck with that.
On golf, right? And he said, I mean, he was speaking decent English, but I think he did say, yeah, but anyway.
Short chapter, that one.
It was a short chapter. 6 weeks later, we met again. And I said, right, okay, well, here we go. Right. Did you do? Yeah, he said, and he got a notebook out. I've got one here. He got a notebook out and went through it. And he said, I have the answer here. I said, the answer. Okay. What is it? Well, and he told about when he was an amateur, but he was playing in the German amateur thing. And he was playing with a guy much older than him. He was about 18 or 19. And he hit his drive off the first tee and he went in the trees on the right. He hit a slice. And the guy said to him as they went up, don't worry about this, Bernhard. You just chip it back out. And Bernhard thought, why is he telling me this? And he went in, found his ball. He saw a gap about that wide in the trees, hit a deliberate slice round and put it to within 6 feet of the flag. And he said, the other golfer, the older golfer, just looked at him in amazement. And he said, and I did laugh. And that was the sum total of the funny times he'd had in a career that had ended up with him winning the Masters.
So were you sitting down with Bernhard after his sort of conversion, after he became a very sort of devout Christian?
He's a born again.
Yeah.
Born again Christian, yeah, and he does the Bible classes on tour. He did, and so on. Yeah, well, we had lots of chats about that because I am not a believer. I'm afraid I'm an atheist.
I also
but I accept that other people do, including my wife, who's a Christian. But that's fine. No, he did. We had lots of interact during that time of interviewing him to get the idea of his life and get an order in my head and the chapters and work out what I was doing with him. It was interesting. The very first time we met was in, I think it's called the Royal Viking or something like that, hotel in York, where there was a golf tournament on. And he said to me, he was staying there, I wasn't. He said, come to me, we have supper tonight and we can talk about the book. This was the very first meeting. And I was sitting there, and the wine waiter came over and said to Bernhard, we'd like the wine list, sir. And Bernhard, at that point, I don't think he does now really either, didn't touch alcohol. He just didn't. And he ate lots of bananas, by the way. He taught me to eat bananas because of the goodness they can do. So he said to the wine waiter, no, thank you. I am fine. I don't drink wine or beer or any of that. So the guy he said, but just a minute. He called him back. He said, give it to my friend. And he said, you drink, don't you? I said, well, I do. I don't.
Journalist.
Well, I'm a journalist. I've got to. It's in the contract. So he gave me and he said, order whichever bottle you want. So I ordered a nice bottle of wine, and that was so. He was not trying to convert me to anything, and we had lots of great discussions about, is there a God? Isn't there a God? I say there isn't. He said there is, but it wasn't an argument. It was two guys who I'd thought about it a lot. He had thought about it a lot and come to a different conclusion to me. That's all.
I interviewed Scott Simpson a while ago, the former US Open champion.
Yeah.
And he was a part of that sort of Bible class scene on the PGA Tour. And there were a lot of players that got drawn to it. And you just wonder whether it was the nature of what they were doing, what they had to do week in, week out, that drew some people to that idea of faith, that need for faith, because it can be a very lonely, very, very punishing job, can't it? Being an elite golfer or an elite sportsman. And I just wonder whether the loneliness of a golf pro and the loneliness of actually playing professional golf, perhaps in that sort of constant touring around the United States with the same people, whether that lends itself almost to, people converting.
Yeah, it could do, certainly. Yeah. I mean, the US tour the European tour, in my experience, I assume it's broadly the same now, but I don't know that. But in all the time that I spent the European tour, there were lots of friendships. I mean, I'm talking about between golfers. There were lots of friendships. Everybody had pals. They had people they had supper with. They had people they had breakfast with, and so on. You go to the American tour. I remember Greg Norman saying to me when he started playing on the PGA Tour, he said when he walks into a locker room or a room with the other players in it, he said it's like opening a fridge door. It's cold. They don't particularly like each other, American golfers, and they particularly don't like people who aren't American, or a lot of them do. It's not the same. And in the time that I was involved with the European tour, everybody knew this was basically a new thing, and everybody felt part of it. Everybody felt they had a job to do. Everybody wanted it to succeed. And of course, they wanted to make a bit of money. There weren't huge amounts of money in those days. I think I finished with my Daily Express salary, placed me 20th on the Order of Merit in the early 80s.
Good effort, Bill. Did you get an invite to the Masters next year, or was that?
Well, I went. Yeah. So it's the American. Look, I've got good American friends, and they're very good Americans. But
I just wanted to ask you a couple more questions about Bernhard Langer. Is it true that at one stage in his sort of prime years that he was playing a completely mismatched set of irons that he referred to as his spanners, like in the sense that he had, from three to sound wedge, they were almost all different sets because he had particular feels with individual clubs. Is that true?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, it is. It is, yeah. I remember his caddy saying he said at a practice round, he came in looking absolutely exhausted. He said, "You see how many clubs are in that bag?" And there was something like 20 clubs in the bag. Because he was trying different ones and saying, "No, I'll have that one." And it didn't matter whether it matched the set or not. If it matched what he wanted it to do, then he had it. So as far as I'm concerned, that is. It may not be true all the time, but it was true.
Yeah, he was mechanical, wasn't he, and scientific. He was Yes, I mean, he's the easy caricature of a German. But I mean, I think what speaks most eloquently about the character of Bernhard Langer is how long he's gone on for, and how seriously he's taken seniors golf, and how successful he's been, and even the fact that he's making cuts in Masters at his age. I mean, that in a way, if you were going to look at all these great players that we're going to discuss, for me, speaks most loudly to Bernhard Langer. As somebody who knows the man, would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I would, absolutely. He's an extraordinary character. He's a very nice man. He's a very decent man. He's a very kind man, and he's a very religious man. I like him a great deal. He's if he's doing something, he's doing it to whatever it is, whether it's unzipping a banana or playing golf or having a marriage or being a dad or whatever. He's doing all those things to the very best of his ability at that time. He is not a perfectionist. He's just wants to do things as well as he can, given the time and the situation.
You're listening to This Golfing Life, a Sounder podcast. Sounder's golf gear is designed from scratch and tested on the course. Get 20% off your next basket at soundergolf.com using the code POD20. That's POD20. There was a difficult dynamic between him and Seve, wasn't there? Because actually they came from very similarly disadvantaged backgrounds, shall we say.
Yeah, that's true.
And they were obviously peers in terms of their age, and they were outsiders who were blazing a trail. So there were lots of similarities. And I think Bernhard Langer, if I'm right in saying it, felt that there should have been more of a connection between them, but Seve very much kept him at arm's length. Does that sound familiar?
It does to an extent. I mean, they had a few little bust-ups that we know about, particularly at Wentworth once. But my own feeling about it is that they respected each other, but occasionally got on each other's nerves hugely. Seve was a very different. I don't know if Seve was at all religious. I've no idea. I really don't. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But Seve was more a freer spirit in a sense than Bernhard. And Seve enjoyed himself. I'm not saying Bernhard didn't enjoy himself, but he enjoyed himself in a different lower level. By lower level, I mean quieter, calmer.
Oh, I thought you meant anatomically.
Well, yes, if you must. Yeah. No, they were two great golfers. In a sense, I mean, Seve had a natural talent. A natural talent for not being able to hit a driver except put it in trouble, and then an even bigger talent for being able to get out the trouble. Getting out of the trouble by hitting a shot you couldn't imagine trying to hit. Bernhard, on the other hand, very carefully thought about golf, thought about the golf clubs he used, thought about the shots he needed to make on particular courses, and followed very, very strict, in his head, very, very strict rules to himself on how you play this game and how you remove the danger.
Yeah.
And he was hugely impressive doing that. But I've always felt that actually, if you take the golf bit out of it, Seve and Bernhard actually liked each other.
I'm sure they did by the end. I think all these players sort of grew closer, apart from maybe one who we'll talk about. But I mean, when was the first time you sat down one-on-one with Seve? I mean, obviously you'd been at the 76 Open. You'd heard Trevino exclaim in delight when Seve played that exquisite pitch and run between the bunkers on the final hole as a 19-year-old.
Yeah.
And then he goes on and wins the Open in 79. You're there again. And the Masters in 1980. And he's suddenly this star that the European Tour can hitch their wagon to. When was it that you first really got to know him? And what are the things that really stand out for you when you think back to Seve?
Well, it was, I first met Seve 1976, and I was introduced to him by another golf writer called Gordon Richardson. And Gordon and I were in some restaurant in Southport in 76. Before the Open began, it was Tuesday or something. We were having something to eat, and in came, I think, 5 or 6 Spanish golfers. And Gordon knew them all because he was I just, I didn't know anyone. And he introduced, saying, "Hey, Gordon, I know, and all that." And Gordon saying hello, and he said, this is, and I'm shaking hands. And he said, "This guy you've got to meet, you got to keep your eye on him. This is Severiano." And it was Seve as a, I mean, how old was Seve then? 19?
He was 19, yeah.
19. And he was, I mean, the first thing that struck you about him was, I'm a straight heterosexual man. But the first thing you thought about him was, Christ, he's good looking.
Yeah.
It just was. It was like meeting Muhammad Ali for the first time. And he's the only man I've ever described as beautiful. But yeah, and Seve didn't, he's had maybe 10 words of English and I had 10 words of Spanish. But I said, you're at football? And he said, see, and it worked out, it was Barcelona. And at that point, the team that I started off supporting was Preston North End. And he said, you. And so I said, Preston, you'd never heard of them, of course, So I said, doesn't matter. And that was meeting Seve for the first time. When I really began to get to know him was when we're back at Southport several years later. I can't remember what year it was.
83, was it? For Tom Watson?
83, yeah. There you go. And the editor had said, you get on with Seve. By then, Seve and I had a relationship. We had a relationship. I wouldn't call it a deep friendship, but it was a relationship. We quite liked each other. And he said, I'd like to get a photograph of Seve. In those days, the Daily Star had copied the Sun in having a good-looking girl not wearing a lot on page 3. And then on page 5, I think it was, once a week, they had the Man of the Week. So he said, do you think could we get Seve to pose for this? I said, well, I said, yeah, okay, let me think about it. He said, well, if he will, tell him we'll pay him £1,000 in cash, in pesetas as it was then, or in sterling or in dollars, whichever he wants. And by the way, could you also ask him, would it... We'd like, this is the editor, it's not the sports editor, it's the editor, and Lloyd Turner, who was a great guy. He said, also, if we get him to do a preview piece for the Open, exclusive Seve Ballesteros, who's going to win the Open, who's going to do this. So I said, yeah, okay. He said, and we'll pay him £1,000 or dollars or pesetas or whatever. I said, okay, leave it with me. So anyway, next time I saw Seve, and by then he speaks a lot better English, I speak a bit of Spanish, so we can converse properly. I said, by the way, my editor thinks you could be the new James Bond, and he'd like to get a photo. I came up with this idea because I thought I'll appeal to Seve's vanity. So I said, I'd like you to dress maybe in a white DJ jacket, bow tie, with a golf club over your shoulder. And he said, and I said, if you do this, he said, we'll pay you £1,000 or dollars or pesetas or whatever. And Seve said, no. He said, oh, you don't want to do it? No, he said, I'll do it. I don't want the money. Honestly, he didn't want the money. So I will look like James Bond in your newspaper. And he knew the newspaper. He said, yeah, I'll do it when we've arranged it. I said, by the way, also he wants to do, I will interview you, but I will write it like it is you doing it. It will say in an interview with me, but it will be by, so he said it will say by Seve Ballesteros, see? I said, yes, it will, in your paper, and he'll give you £1,000. No, you don't want to do it. No, I do it. Get my name on the story, but I don't want the money. And he turned that money down too. So we did the things, and they worked out really well. It was the PGA Championship was on down at Royal St. George's, and I arranged for when he finished his first round, I'd be waiting, got in my car, we drove to whatever hotel it is down there, and the photographer Mark Boodlon was there, and he had set up in the right of the hotel, the corner.
Nice and public.
A bit of lighting and this, that, and the other. And he had brought the clothes for Seve. So Seve went behind a screen, ripped off his shirt, put on another shirt, got the jacket, everything, the red rose in here. And we'd taken a golf club, and he puts the golf club over his shoulder, and Mark takes it. And it was a superb photograph. Honestly, absolutely superb.
I thought you were going to say, Bill, that your sports editor, this page 5 fella of the week, I have a vague memory of one of the tabloids having a page 7 fella. And I thought, oh my God, you're going to have to ask Seve to take his top off and sort of, that was I was going to say that would have been a tough ask.
No. They once asked me to ask a Manchester United footballer to do it, but I'm not asking. I said to him when I saw him, because we knew each other, I said, well, listen, I said, I'm not asking you this. I'm just telling you this is what they wanted you to do, but I know your answer will be no.
Yeah, because there was a real tradition of getting sports stars to dress up in sort of for novelty photographs, whether it was sort of Peter Shilton in a French postmaster's hat because he was delivering England's ticket to the semi-finals or whatever.
Yeah. But Seve's photograph was great. He looked great. It looked sophisticated, actually. And he did look $1 million. So we had it done. So I then thought, well, and meanwhile, I'd had the exclusive story on the fact he had a girlfriend. He was going to marry her called Carmen, right?
Okay.
That was a world exclusive. He gave that to me, Seve. And I knew Carmen as well, and she's a lovely lady. And I thought, well, I'll get this photograph, and we'll get it. We got it nicely framed. And next time I see Seve, I'll give it to him to give to Carmen. So I did that, and he said, it's good. It's my friend. I said, yeah, give it to Carmen. By then they were engaged. She can put it on her bed. The next time I saw Carmen was a few weeks later. It was at Wentworth during a PGA championship or something. And I'm walking around and see Carmen. Hey, Carmen. Hey, Bill. And we're chatting. And I said, oh, by the way, did you like the photograph? She said, beautiful photograph. Beautiful. I said, have you got it on your bedside table? And she stopped, looked at me and said, no. I said, why not? She said, because Seve's got it on his bedside table.
Yeah.
So that's where the photograph ended up. He ended up waking up looking at himself every morning on his bedside table.
Well, if you look like that, you probably want to look at yourself every morning, to be honest with you. It'd probably make you quite happy.
Well, I told him off about it. Yeah, I told him that's disgraceful.
But what about if we move on to Seve, I could talk about Seve all day. He's my all-time hero. Sure. I love the man. Sure. I was fortunate enough to interview him on a few occasions. But if we talk about the three British players that are part of that generation, you've got Sandy Lyle, Nick Faldo, and Ian Woosnam. I mean, Sandy and Ian Woosnam played together as boys, didn't they?
Yeah.
And they all competed together as very promising young amateurs. What was the dynamic between those three who were following hard on Seve's heels and sort of in his wake?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there was a real dynamic between Sandy and Woozy. They liked each other. They known each other since they were kids and so on. Nick, quite naturally, his natural behavior is not to be particularly warm or close to most people. And so they respected him. I respected him as a golfer. But a lot of people didn't particularly like him because he was very closed off. And you're never quite sure, in the 80s anyway, through to the 90s, which Nick Faldo you were going to get, because he could be very moody. And some days you would see him and he would go, hi, Bill, hi, Bill, how you doing? I'm fine, thank you. On other days, he would just look at you and totally ignore you. That said, Nick Faldo has never, ever refused me an interview. And I've had some very good interviews with him.
I had my experience with Nick Faldo. I mean, my first Open was 1990, and that was peak Faldo, I think, when he won at St Andrews. Absolutely decimated Greg Norman, who was world number one at the time. Yeah. But then many years later, I was playing in a golf day at Wentworth, a corporate golf day, and Faldo was on the second tee on the West Course on the par 3, playing with every group that came through. And I was very lucky. I was about to go and play in the Dunhill Links, and in my 5 minutes of chat with Faldo on that tee, I said, my chipping's terrible. As anybody who knows me will know, that's a perennial state. I'm going to play the Dunhill Links. I'd love to know, have you got just a tip on a sort of chip and run? And he goes, come and see me on the practice ground afterwards. And I thought, there's no way he's going to be there. The last group will come through on the second. He'll be in his car, and off he goes. And sure enough, 4.5, 5 hours later, he was waiting for me on the practice ground, on the practice tee at Wentworth. And he gave me literally 45-minute intense lesson. I don't think it improved my chipping, but he couldn't have been more engaged and more totally sort of committed to me improving this shot. Yeah. And I thought that was a absolute revelation about Faldo, because I'd always seen him in the way that you described, Bill, difficult to get to know.
Yeah.
Constant foot in mouth. I think my verdict on those limited encounters is he's just socially awkward.
Yes. absolutely. That is absolutely what he is, or has been. And I've felt sorry. He's annoyed the hell out of me at times, but I've also felt sorry for him. I've thought exactly what you've just said. This guy doesn't know how to deal with people, which is, I think, one of the reasons he's great with kids.
Yeah. I mean, look at the Faldo series. It's been fantastic
The Faldo
for
series,
golf.
yeah. And he's great with kids because it's because they're just waiting for him to do, But with adults, he's uncomfortable.
Yeah, his sense of humor, unfortunately, is a bit akin to dropping an anvil on a dinner table. But he's, but I think his heart's in the right place. I think in latter years, when he's become a commentator and he's opened up a bit more, he still has that ability to sort of make you cringe with some of his humor.
Yeah.
But I think he's trying. I think he's really tried to come across as a better individual, a bit like Steve Davis did after his top flight snooker career had finished. That was when his personality sort of blossomed a bit more.
Yeah. Although I knew Steve Davis really well and I really liked him before that stage, but it was a different Steve Davis that I knew.
Yes.
But yeah, but Nick, part of Nick's, I don't know whether it was part of a game plan or whatever, but Nick's idea was to be different, to be separate, and most important of all, to be the best. And he was the best.
Yeah, he really was absolutely dominant for about 4 years, probably, wasn't he? And people tend to forget that because hard on his heels came Tiger, who took that dominance to a whole new level. Talking of Tiger, he was famously impossible and famously impenetrable for journalists.
Yes.
How would you describe your job changing, if you like, in the sort of early years of Tiger? Did you detect a big change?
Yeah. It seemed I'm not being wise after the event. It seemed obvious. I mean, the famous story, and it's a true story of something before he was actually on the tour or whatever, but everybody knew about him. And somebody asked Sandy Lyle, "What do you think of Tiger Woods?" And Sandy's reply was, "I've never played them." Sorry, and he was serious. He didn't, But that's dear old Sandy, who's lovely.
Yes,
I remember when he won that Masters rather. When he won that Masters, that is the most important, significant Masters of all the Masters that I've covered. I thought the Jack Nicklaus one and the Sandy Lyle victory, because Sandy was a good friend. It's lovely to watch a pal achieve a dream. Tiger's beat them all.
Yeah.
And he moved golf. And the most important fact is the type of player he was. But the even more important fact than that was the color of his skin. And he just made, and his smile initially anyway, this guy is interesting people who do not give a toss about golf, whatever sport they follow. They don't care about golf. They don't play it. They don't follow it, whatever. And I thought a lot of them are going to start watching this guy. They're going to watch him. Jack Nicklaus was fabulous player, obviously, but I've never seen anybody, particularly between those early years when he was just unstoppable before he went slightly mad. But that is the greatest golf that's ever been played. He is the best golfer that's ever lived, I believe.
Yeah, I think there's a very strong argument.
The most significant, and although he doesn't describe himself as a black guy because his mum's from the Far East and so on, he's a mixture. But to the naked eye, he's a black guy. He would talk. He told me about getting the country clubs there before people knew who he was. What's that black guy doing in here? It's awful. Yeah. It's terrible.
Talking of a player who perhaps wanted to change the game but didn't ultimately, Greg Norman, who I've spoken to a few players that have been close to Norman over the years, and they've given me a variety of perspectives on him, but the one that seems to come through is his sort of utter macho need to be the alpha in every situation.
He's very Aussie.
Very Aussie. Tell me about when you first met Greg Norman, and I'd love to hear a bit about your view on him, because you got to know him.
Yeah.
And then we'll perhaps discuss his legacy.
Well, I like Greg very much. I think he's made some daft decisions in his life, but and so have I. Perhaps you have too. I don't know.
More than a few.
No, I like Greg. When I first came across Greg, I had no idea who he was. I forget what the tournament was, but whatever it was. I rocked up at Sunningdale in my company Ford Cortina, parked the car, and at that moment, in next to me, comes a beautiful, shiny black Rolls Royce, which grabbed my attention. So I parked the thing. So I'm getting out of my car, and this guy, turns out to be Greg, gets out of that car. So suddenly this guy who's tall, good-looking, blonde hair, all the rest of it, and who the hell's that? So we looked at each other, because we both got out of the cars at the same time, and said, one of us said, I may have said it first, morning. He said, morning, or whatever. And I said, I went round to get something out of my boot. He went to the boot to get his clubs out. I said, you're playing here this week, yeah? He said, yeah. I said, my name's Bill. I'm a journalist. My name's Greg. And it was his first event on the European tour. And we had a little chat for 5 minutes. I just said, well, you're starting off driving a Rolls. What's your ambition? He said, that's not mine. And he'd been loaned it by somebody who was looking after him. And told him, take the Rolls Royce, you'll make a name for yourself.
But there is an expression of that that alpha spirit, turning up to his first European tour event in a shiny Rolls Royce as an unknown. Right. I mean, that's planting your flag, isn't it?
It is. And I didn't think of it in those terms at that time. I just thought, this guy's different. And I kept an eye on him that week, obviously. I can't remember what he did. He made the cut. He didn't win it. And gradually over weeks, months of covering the European tour or whatever, I liked him. He was straightforward. He could be amusing. We treated each other decently. And I got to know him. And then, in fact, he sent me, I've got it up here somewhere. What's he say? After he sent me a photograph when he won the Open. I was invited down to the little celebration he did. I was only a journalist there. And we did a photograph together with a glass of champagne on our side. And then he signed it and sent it to me. I didn't ask him to do this. And it says, let me get it. That's the photograph. You can see it.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah. And it says, Billy. He always called me Billy. The only person in the world who's ever called me Billy. Thanks for your help, support, and friendship. And signed it. And that was totally unasked for. I had nothing to do with that. Apart from the fact there was a cameraman in there, and he said, go on, let's have a picture of you guys. Apart from that, I knew the picture was taken. I didn't expect to ever see it. Greg and I, and then we went. Do you remember the Bob Hope Classics?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. And they had the gala dinner at Grosvenor House. So I went to it with my wife to the gala dinner, and Greg was there, and his wife wasn't over here at that point, his first wife. And he was with his great pal, the photographer. Anyway. As we're leaving, I'm leaving, Mitchell Platts and his wife were leaving, and we're leaving together. And Greg comes up and says, come on, he said, we're going to go to Annabelle's. All right? You ever been to Annabelle's?
I have, once in my dim and distant past, yeah.
Right, okay.
I know of the legend of Annabelle's and where it is.
Annabelle's in Berkeley Square and all that. Exactly. When we're going there. And he had a Rolls Royce again. This time it was his. And we got in anyway. There were about 6 or 7 of us. And the only way my wife could get in, Greg said, sit on my knee. So she sat on Greg's knee, which is fine, except he was driving. We drove to Annabelle's and eventually we left Annabelle's at 5 o'clock in the morning. And
people tend to forget with Greg, he raced to the pinnacle of the European tour. His time on the European tour was fairly brief because he got to the top and his eyes were on America. And then he went to America and he became world number one. He became a major star on the PGA Tour.
Yeah.
But then he had this huge fight with them, around creating the world tour in the sort of the mid-90s, early to mid-90s, which was, for people of a certain vintage, you can remember that. It was a sort of for the reins of golf, if you like. Tell us a bit about that existential fight for the control of professional golf that took place really at Greg Norman's insistence in the early 90s, because Liv was the second time around, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he had it all worked out. He had big money people behind it and so on. And he ended up very much against the PGA Tour, I think. Because he was not treated well by other players who didn't like this Aussie coming over, good-looking Aussie, blonde. Half of America think he's a surfer boy from California. They don't realize he's bloody Australian. And he was, he really wanted that to work. To be honest, I didn't care whether it worked or not. I wouldn't have been bothered if he'd actually got it off the ground. But he obviously met a lot of resistance and probably...
He expected PGA Tour players to come with him, which is interesting to what you say, Bill, about the fact that he was treated badly. He probably had a chip on his shoulder by some of them, But
but probably the ones
some
you
to come with him.
Yeah, but probably the ones who treated him badly. They didn't physically do anything. They just were not nice to him. They almost certainly were the ones who weren't making huge amounts of money and objected to this foreigner coming in and winning things or taking big checks most weeks. Whereas the ones who were already winning the big checks continued to win the big checks. So those were the players he was interested in. He wanted the best players. He didn't want the bottom half, if you call it the bottom half. He wanted the top half, or the top quarter even. And it kind of made sense because he is an Australian, and Australians have a different view. And if you live where Australia is, or New Zealand, you've got a different view on life. The culture is broadly similar to European/American in some ways, but they are separate. And I think that he wanted to make golf a world game. He really did.
I have a lot of, support for that position because I do think, golf would be better if we had a global tour that took in Australia, South Africa, Great Britain, as England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland, some of the historic opens in Europe, the Far East. It would be great. And I'm sick to the back teeth of the age of, everything being focused on the PGA Tour, even to the extent where, the prize for the top 10 players in Europe is to leave Europe and go and play in America.
I know.
It seems like it's completely out of whack. So I think Greg Norman was onto a really good idea. And I think even some aspects of Liv, have their heart in the right place, perhaps. But he just wasn't the person he was far too Marmite, wasn't he, to really ever pull that off?
Yeah. That called for diplomacy and subtlety and all the things that dear Greg doesn't really have a lot of, But I loved him. And I wasn't the only one who really liked him. And we had a lot of fun together in the 80s into the 90s before inevitably we drifted apart. I remember when I was made redundant by Express newspapers, and somebody had told him, "Oh, do you hear, Bill, that they've got rid of Bill because he was earning too much?" And
nice problem to have.
Yeah, he rang me and said, "Listen, do you want a job?" Because by then he had a private plane. He said, "Every time I come to London, you can wash the plane if you want." So that's cool. That's cool. So
His legacy, what do you think his legacy looks like? I mean, he was an extraordinary golfer, but, is his legacy going to be as a failed disruptor?
I'm afraid for a lot of people, it probably is. It isn't for me. He was both the luckiest and the unluckiest golfer I've ever known. Because he should have had at least 3 or 4 more majors. He should have had a master. Larry Mize holding that. I mean, come on. And no offense to Larry Mize, but would anybody miss Larry Mize if he hadn't won the I mean, that was just, and there were other, you'll know them yourself, other problems that he faced with other players getting suddenly very lucky.
Yeah.
Just the wrong time for him. But he did throw one away. I mean, he threw one Masters away when whatever he did, he bladed or pushed his forearm.
That was 86. Yeah, people tend to forget that in that 86 Masters and Nicklaus one. Yeah, and then you could argue as well that when Faldo blew him away in the final round at Augusta, he still shot a very poor round.
Yeah, he did,
and he did sort of fold like a deck chair, I think, that day, which obviously was sad to watch, and it was sad to watch for Faldo to a certain extent, who was very genuine in his commiserations with Norman on the 18th green.
He did seem that way, didn't he? Yeah, when he said, don't let the bastards get to you, referring to us.
When have you fallen out with people you've written about? And can you
tell me what I've written?
Yeah, because of what you've written, or the way that, not necessarily because of what you've written, but the way that they've taken what you've written.
Yeah, so sometimes people do take it. Yeah, well, the worst one was Kenny Dalglish.
Really?
When he was manager at Liverpool, and I wrote some piece about Liverpool, whatever it was. I was very critical, and he banned me from Anfield. What he didn't know was a couple of people had asked me, they wanted to get him something, and he said, because Kenny's always said, golf is my passion, football's my job, And he was a big, big fan of Seve Ballesteros, and he said, can you get Seve Ballesteros to sign a golf glove for Kenny? I said, yeah, sure. So meanwhile, he banned me, so the golf glove is in the corner of this study. He never got it. I thought, well, sod you, Kenny. You're not getting your golf glove back.
Kenny and Seve are my two sporting gods. There can be no other way of describing them. Within golf, how thin-skinned could some of these hyper-talented players that we've discussed be at times? I mean, your job, as we've said before, is first and foremost to cover what's happening, to provide a perspective, to give readers an insight.
Sure.
But to do that successfully, you've got to push the envelope at times, haven't you?
You do. I don't really. I'd one exquisitely awful experience with Nick Faldo, but
would you care to describe that exquisitely awful experience, Bill? Give us some context.
Wasn't about anything I'd written. All right, I'll tell this as quickly as I can. It's quite a long story. The editor at the time was raising money for the Children's Hospital in London. Yeah. And our aim was to get to £1 million, which doesn't sound that much relatively now, but it was then. And he asked us all of us who had access to football players, sports people, actors, well-known people or whatever, to get stuff that could be auctioned, right? And I was friends with John Simpson, who was Nick Faldo and Sandy Lyle's manager at the time for IMG. I still am friends with John. And I said to him, look, I'm just doing this. Can he give us a couple of sweaters or some old golf clubs or something? He said, let me think. And he came back. He said, I've thought about that. He said, no, we won't bother with sweaters. Why don't we do a round at Wentworth? So play with Nick for 18 holes and play with Sandy for 18 holes. And the highest, just put it out to auction, and the highest offers made for 4 people will play these games. So that's great. Okay, the editor was chuffed. We put it in the paper. Anyway, 4 people, 8 people in total, offer between £4,000 and £5,000 each. So we, made a lot of money out of it. And I thought, well, I will, with Faldo, I didn't do it with Sandy. I couldn't. I was somewhere else. I said to Nick, okay, you're doing this. We've got the readers. We're giving them, everyone has lunch afterwards in the clubhouse and so on. I'd like to caddy for you. So he said, yeah, sure. Okay. He was playing in the French Open before that, where he finished second. He finished on the Sunday night, got back that night, and I met him at 8:30 the following morning at Wentworth, and I caddied for him. Meanwhile, probably encouraged by the fact I knew I was going to caddy for him, I had a dream that night that said it was coming up to the Open Championship, and in my dream, he won the Open. I mean, properly won it. And I remember that very vividly. I remember telling him, by the way, you're going to win the Open. I dreamt it last night. And he did win that Open. I did the same thing with Rory McIlroy 2 years ago, actually.
Well, can I phone you up before the next major, please, just to see whether you've had any dreams?
You can just call it chance, but I've had various...
Clairvoyancy is the
pleasant
next
things
challenge.
happened to me in my life. Yeah, I put 50 quid on Rory 2 years ago.
Days. So you've asked Faldo to play.
So,
you're on the bag, and you've told him he's going to win.
Yeah, and we go round. I was absolutely, the size of those bloody bags, and I was crawling coming over the back. And when we got to the end, and so there's about a dozen of us running around, he said, "You look." I said, "I don't know how Fanny is caddy does this regularly because a bag's so." He said, "Well, have you looked at it properly?" So I looked at it. He said, "How many clubs are there?" And I counted the clubs. There were 16. He said, "Have you looked inside?" I said, "No, I haven't looked inside. I'll have a look inside." So I looked inside. There was a big brick. He was having a house built just down the road from Wentworth. He'd been that morning and picked up, not an ordinary brick, a big brick, and put it in the golf bag. And he'd put a dozen golf balls in the golf bag. He said, "That'll teach you to, and I said, "Oh, well done." He then took the brick off me and he signed it. It's up here. It says, "To Bill, what a brick."
Well, there you go. I think in some ways that sort of confirms my point about Nick Faldo's sense of humour. It's slightly off beam, but so you lugged that brick around.
I have to say, but when I went, he then said, when we had a photographer, the photographer was taking pictures of him handing me the brick, right? And it's okay. So, and he said, "I want one of those pictures," he said to the photographer. So 3 weeks later, we're at the Scottish Open up in Scotland, obviously. And the photographer had given me the picture, that size, of him presenting me with the brick. So I went to look for him, and he was on the practice ground with two guys in suits, obviously some kind of sponsors or whatever they were. And Fanny was there as well. He'd been practice putting. So I just went round and stood 6 feet back as they were talking. And he turned and said, "Yeah, what do you want?" I said, "I've brought you that picture." He said, "What picture?" So I handed it to him, and he got it out and looked at it. And he's got a real bad face on, and he said, "Why the fuck would I want that?" and dropped it on the green. And I was so angry. I don't know. If I get really angry, my instinct is to cry at the same time, which is a bit discouraging. Tears in my eyes with anger. I wanted to hit him. Now he's that much taller than me, so I'd have to reach up. But thankfully I didn't try to do that. I just looked at him. Fanny looked at me. The two guys in suits were sort of, "What the hell's going on?" Fanny looked at me,
Bad day at the office.
I just turned on my heel and walked away, and I thought, from here on in, Nick, every chance I get, I'm going to stick a pin into your leg, metaphorically.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, how those experiences with sports stars, and, as a journalist, you can't be a fan and a journalist, but it's amazing how those really negative encounters stay with you. I had a few over the course of my career, but then, by the same token, you're often surprised by people's kindness and decency, and sometimes just finding out interesting things about them. And Ian Woosnam could be quite a spiky character as well, couldn't he? He was the last of that group to come through.
Yeah,
an incredible natural talent, but he could also be a handful, couldn't he?
He could, yeah. It was a good man not to have an argument with, because he was very, very strong. He might have only 5'4.5", he always said the half inch was important.
Have you ever seen Ian Woosnam throw a punch?
I've seen Ian Woosnam display strength. It was always fine with me. I mean, it was.
What did he lift up?
Probably me. No, he was okay. It was okay, but he could be difficult. And he had certainly at the time, he probably had a bit of a drink problem. So it depends where he was with alcohol.
Yeah, well, that's
what his mood was or whatever.
That's sort of a bit of an unspoken issue for tour players. There's quite a few actually that probably still struggle and did struggle over the years. I mean, it comes back to that point about it being a very lonely and hard and inwardly focused experience, being a player at that level and having to make your money from ability over 4 days.
It is. It's a very difficult job to do, and you've obviously seen it, been aware of it, been part of it, and you've worked that out as we all do. The last thing in the world I'd like to be is a professional golfer.
Yeah. I think that's a very good point. Well, Bill, over your long and distinguished career, you've done a brilliant job in terms of bringing some of these personalities, many of these huge personalities within the sport, to many, many, many readers. Thanks for very much for coming on the podcast and sharing some of these stories. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks very much for your time, Bill.
That was a pleasure. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to This Golfing Life. You can find out more about Sounder at soundergolf.com. If you want to follow me and find out more about RNGC, Britain's premier backyard golf course, you can find me on Instagram at RNGC 2021. Thanks for listening.